Hey, good morning, everyone. Meteorologist Steve Caparata here, checking in from the home office. Been a little while since we've done this, and wasn't really expecting to be doing this in the early part of November, but here we are with a new tropical depression that has formed this morning. That is Tropical Depression number 18 in the south central, southwestern Caribbean. It is forecast to become Raphael, which is the next name up on our list, and it is forecast to move into the Gulf of Mexico. So, obviously, getting a lot of attention. We don't often talk about systems in the month of November into the Gulf of Mexico, at least anything beyond maybe the Eastern Gulf. But this looks to be one of those unusual systems that may get a little deeper into the Gulf than history usually tells us is kind of what we expect. So let's kind of take a look at what's going on this morning. First off, here's a look at the broad view on satellite, which you'll first note is the Gulf of Mexico itself largely cloud free right now. But the system we're tracking, of course, we get a bad frame coming in right as to start this. Let me see if I can take out that bad frame real quick so that doesn't block our view. All right, so that should be fixed now. Let me loop this again. So the hurricane hunters out investigating the system earlier this morning. They checked it out yesterday, but went back out this morning and found not only do we have a well-developed center of circulation, which we already had yesterday, but now we kind of have some thunderstorm activity co-located with that center of circulation. That was the only thing holding it back from getting the designation as Tropical Depression number 18 yesterday, but it is now Tropical Depression number 18 as of 9 o'clock this morning. The other thing to get used to here, of course, daylight saving time came to an end early Sunday morning, and most of hurricane season, our main advisories come out 10 a.m., 4 p.m., 10 p.m., 4 a.m. Well, with the time change, we'll have to kind of adjust our way of thinking. The advisories will be 9 a.m., 3 p.m., 9 p.m., 3 a.m. The main advisories, and we get intermediate advisories in between that. All right, so here are the stats as of 9 a.m. Maximum winds 35 miles per hour. Moving to the north at 9, you can see shaded in yellow there, Jamaica, under a tropical storm warning. You've got the Cayman Islands in red under a hurricane warning, so it kind of clues you in what's expected, and western Cuba in orange under a hurricane watch at this point in time. So the official forecast shows it kind of bending to the northwest over the next couple of days, and note that the official forecast does show it becoming a hurricane as it approaches western Cuba on Wednesday. So one thing we'll kind of watch on Wednesday is, does it strengthen pretty quickly over the next 48 hours? And then second thing is, how much does it interact with Cuba? Of course, Cuba is pretty narrow, so if any weakening does occur, that'll probably be fairly temporary and not have a real significant impact on the storm. We'll keep an eye on that. And this is the unusual part. We get storms in November every once in a while. Usually, if they're headed into the Gulf at that point in time, they tend to bend to the north and northeast. But this one actually shown kind of bending northwest or west northwest, a very unusual path for the month of November. So, what you'll note here is that the Hurricane Center does still, let me get my drawing tool back up. They still have this Category 1 hurricane on Friday, but then shows some weakening by Saturday morning down to a tropical storm. So that's a little bit of good news. We do think as if the system even gets into the northern Gulf, which we'll talk about in a moment, is still a question mark. But if it does get into the northern Gulf, conditions expected to become less favorable. And I'll show you why that is in a moment. So right now, the official forecast shows it's still offshore of the Gulf Coast Saturday morning as a tropical storm. But keep in mind, not only do we have uncertainty across the track, left and right, if you will, when it comes to forecasting a storm, there's what we kind of say a long track forecast error. Is it going to move a little more slowly, a little more quickly than what is shown? So still some margin of error in there as well. Let's give you a look at some of the spaghetti plots which kind of illustrate some of this lingering uncertainty. Now, in the short term, forecast confidence is fairly high. We'll show you that with the spaghetti plots, and you'll see here through Wednesday afternoon, Wednesday evening, the lines are pretty tightly clustered, which tells us we have pretty good confidence. It's be moving northwest, more than likely moving over western Cuba at some point on Wednesday, and then emerging in the southeastern Gulf. It's as we get beyond that time frame that we start to see a split develop. So notice that by Friday morning, you're starting to see those lines spread out a bit. You're starting to see some of them with that bend even more westward, which gets pretty unusual in the month of November. And then as I advance it into Saturday, what you see here is, let me highlight a couple of things. You've got a cluster of models that brings this system ashore at some point on Saturday, anywhere from Mississippi in Florida. And then you've got a cluster that still has this offshore of Louisiana Saturday evening, Saturday night. That's a huge split in the guidance right now, right? So what that tells us is the key takeaway right now is that we've got pretty good forecast confidence through Wednesday. Beyond about Wednesday afternoon, that confidence really drops off. There are a lot of different potential scenarios on the board. So let's take a look at a couple of those. First off, here's the GFS model, the American model, as some people call it. And so let me show you what's going on here. This is right about now, and our system is roughly down in here. And we'll advance this, and we'll pause at a couple of different points. But the GFS does bring it across western Cuba on Wednesday. Here it is Wednesday evening now, merging from Cuba into the southeastern Gulf. From there, the GFS kind of has it moving kind of slowly northwest. Here we are Friday morning, and you can see it's still offshore in the Gulf of Mexico. And let me put a distance on this. So from the mouth of the river to the center at that point in time, it's about 200 miles from the mouth of the Mississippi River, about 200 miles southeast of the mouth of the Mississippi River in this particular run of the GFS, Friday morning around daybreak. And then as we advance it, what you'll see is the GFS kind of has it turn a little more northward and has it moving essentially into the coast of Mississippi by Saturday morning, keeping most of the weather a bit east of us. And from there, has it moving inland during the day on Saturday. So under a scenario like that, we're largely fine here. Don't get really much away of significant impacts. Now, extreme southeast Louisiana will get in on some wind and maybe some squalls, but also keep in mind the trend there is for a weakening system. So the GFS, certainly Baton Rouge westward, shows it not being much of an issue as it keeps the storm largely a decent amount east of us. Now here's the European model. We start out now, we advance this, and again, very similar to the GFS, maybe a touch slower over the next 48 hours or so, but still has it kind of emerging from Cuba into the southeastern Gulf by late Wednesday. And then from there, pretty quickly, you can note that how quickly it starts turning it to the left. Doesn't have it gaining much latitude in the Gulf. That's Friday morning. So remember, the GFS Friday morning had it about 200 miles southeast of the mouth of the river. The European has it 400 plus south of the mouth of the river. That's a huge difference. You're already looking at, by Friday morning, a 200 plus mile difference between those two models. So it really illustrates the uncertainty going forward. Let me get that little illustration off. But the key point there is, what you see is the European keeps it drifting westward through the weekend, keeps it well south of us, and implies that it could head towards Mexico, which would be an exceptionally unusual track for the month of November. I have to double check, but I don't think Texas has ever been impacted in the month of November, and certainly Mexico probably not either. And we've only had one impact, if you will, in Louisiana in November, and that wasn't even a landfall. That was Ida, not the 2021, the 2009 version of Ida. Came up on a track, something like, oops, wrong tool. Hang on. Let me get the right illustration tool up. But you got the general idea. Came up on a track, something like that. Got close enough to extreme southeast Louisiana. Got some tropical storm force winds, but wasn't even a landfall. So if you were to get something like the European like that, That would probably be unprecedented in the historical record for the month of November. So you're looking at a huge split in the model guidance right now. All right. And the other thing you kind of, let me point out one other thing. Give me a second to draw in a front here. So European by Sunday is showing a cold front, still a little bit northwest of us. Some prior runs of the models had that front making more eastward progress a bit sooner, and that was part of what might pick the system up to the north. So there's also uncertainty on how quickly that front moves east, how that interacts with the potential system in the Gulf. So here's a look at kind of an overview of what's going to be steering it, we think. And there's really two key features here. Number one is high pressure right now that's kind of centered over Florida and the Bahamas. And number two is what's going to be a trough over the western half of the country. Not sure why it's, let's see if it'll let me draw again. Not sure why it's not letting me. Let's see if it'll, there we go. So high pressure east of us right now, trough out to the west. Let's advance this with time. We'll pause at a couple of different points. So through Wednesday, what's going to happen largely, we think, here's our high, is that tropical depression number 18, future Rainfall, will be rotating around the periphery of that high pressure center. It's beyond Wednesday that the uncertainty grows on what happens with that high and that trough out to our west. So this is the European model that I'm showing you right now. And the European, two things here. Number one, shows a slower progression, really keeps that trough out west, and as a result has a bit more ridging of high pressure developing north of the system, and that's why it kind of keeps it going west through the end of the week and even on into the weekend. By contrast, if I were to show you, say, the GFS model, it has this trough moving east a bit more quickly and helping to pick the storm up and grab it and take it to the north. The other question with the steering is what's also going to impact the steering and where the storm goes is the intensity of the storm beyond midweek. That'll kind of impact what it feels in terms of steering. So right now, just a whole lot of uncertainty on what happens once we get beyond Wednesday. Here's what the Hurricane Center has in terms of tropical storm wind probability. So this is based off of their 9 a.m. advisory. This goes through the next 5 days. So basically through Saturday morning. The dark green shading is in essence showing a 5 to 10% chance for a decent chunk of our viewing area that we would get sustained tropical storm force winds by Saturday morning. Well, you get into sort of that next shade of green right in here. That's a 10 to 20% chance. So right now, low chances of sustained tropical storm force winds reaching southeast Louisiana by Saturday morning based on that latest advisory. Now, why do we think whatever comes of the system could weaken as it gets deeper into the Gulf? Let's talk about this. So here's a look at moisture in the mid part of the atmosphere. Basically, when you look at this, where you're looking at shades of green, that's where the atmosphere's got a lot of moisture. Humidity is pretty high. Where you get into more of these maroons and browns, that's where drier air is in place. So let's advance it with time. And what you'll see here on the European is that through Wednesday, Thursday, it's embedded in a fairly moist environment, maybe even on Friday. But by Friday, you can see how it's starting to get closer to some of this drier air in the western and northern Gulf of Mexico. And if it were to track into the northern Gulf like the Hurricane Center track shows, it would start to likely ingest some of that dry air, which is not healthy for a tropical system. The other thing we're tracking is wind shear. Upper level winds are forecast to be stronger near the northern Gulf Coast and over the southern U.S. later this week. In the short term, it looks like the environment is pretty favorable for strengthening. Very low wind shear over the Caribbean right now. So that's why I think over the next couple of days, the environment should be pretty favorable for this to become a hurricane. So there it is on Wednesday. with most of the stronger winds over the southern U.S. at that point in time. And then as we advance this, again, if it were to follow a track close to what the Hurricane Center is showing, so again, that's basically the forecast for Saturday morning from the Hurricane Center. At that point in time, it's likely to start feeling some of these stronger upper level winds if it were to take a track like that. So the combination of some drier air and increasing wind shear, we think would likely lead to some weakening, even if it did decide to track closer to Louisiana. So it's a key point. Let's paint the worst case. If we were to even get a tropical system tracking our way Friday and the Saturday, this is not expected to be a very strong system. It would likely feel those factors that would cause weakening. So the main concern would be some gusty winds and some rain out of the system and maybe some coastal flooding as it stands right now. So we'll keep an eye on it. Now, what about the water temperatures? You might wonder about the water temperatures here in November. Say, is the water warm enough? Yeah, well, obviously it's not as warm as it was in the peak of the summer, but there's still a decent chunk of the Gulf of Mexico running 80 plus degrees, which we look as roughly the threshold for a tropical system. So much of the Gulf is still plenty warm enough for a tropical system. Now, as it gets into the northern Gulf, those water temperatures drop off a bit, and that's yet another factor that would tend to induce at least some slow weakening with any potential tropical system as it got more into the northern Gulf. What about the rain? So here's what the Weather Prediction Center has over the next 7 days, which takes us all the way through Monday. And what you see here, pretty obvious to see they've got some pretty good rains in the eastern Gulf, closer to the track of the system. In our part of the world, they're showing on average anywhere from 3/4 of an inch of rain to 1.5 inches for most of us. Not a big deal. So it's showing maybe we'll get some rain from this tropical system, and there's still the potential that we feel the influence of a cool front trying to move in from the west. There's been some hints that, what a day or two ago looked like the front moving through. Maybe it doesn't make it through here, and that's part of what's complicating the steering. But still, a couple of features that lead to at least some rainfall, but right now, as it stands, nothing to indicate anything major. All right, so that's kind of a summary of what we know right now. And I think what I would emphasize right here is that we feel pretty good about what we know about things through Wednesday. Beyond that, we don't feel very confident about what happens Thursday, Friday into the weekend. So I'm getting a lot of questions, obviously, about the LSU game against Bama on Saturday. It's just too soon to say. Right now, I would honestly say level of concern is still pretty low that we would get any major impacts. That would be a major problem coming up on Saturday. But so much is going to depend on the track and evolution of the system. So what it's going to take at this point in time, some patience, my friends. We're going to have to be patient with this. And hopefully over the next day or two, things start to come in a little better focus. We're still in the organizational stage of the system, so not unusual that there would be more uncertainty with time. But even the Hurricane Center is pointing out in their forecast discussions that uncertainty is much higher than usual as we get into days 4, 5, and beyond. All right, that's just about all that I had. Let me we'll take a quick peek at a Facebook page here or two, just to see if there's any questions before I wrap up. But I don't want to spend too much time on questions just yet because there are just so many unknowns. All right, let's see. I think it did point out, very unusual to be talking about a tropical system potentially impacting Louisiana in November. We've only really had one impact on record, if you will, and that was Ida in 2009. Marshall's asking why this late in the season. It's a good question. The season's been pretty unusual overall. If you remember the forecast at the beginning, it was forecast to be a hyperactive season, and it started out that way, it seemed like, with Beryl, which became a Category 5 very early, and then produced a significant impact in Texas early on in the season. Then we kind of hit the heart of the season and things were unusually quiet. And that was weird. And then we've kind of in recent weeks had an uptick in activity again. One thing we know is that, down in the Caribbean, for instance, it's still running very warm. Another thing gets a little more in the weeds with the meteorology, but something we track called the MJO, the Madden-Julian Oscillation. It's something that within a given season, it has phases where it tends to favor more development or less development. Right now, even though we're late in the season, the MJO is a little more favorable with general conditions in the Caribbean and parts of the Gulf of Mexico. And we think that may be a factor in some of this late season development as well. All right. Like I said, there's a lot of unknowns right now, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. So just be patient. We'll be tracking this. We'll keep you updated. Jeff Morrow's going to be on today at noon and 4. I'll be back on air 5, 6, and 10. We'll have lots of updates coming for you on social media, on digital. But just understand that at this point in time, even when you look at that forecast cone, I know that kind of gets your attention, right? Looks not so great for Louisiana. Just understand there's a lot of uncertainty at this time. And even if we did get something headed our way late this week or this weekend, it's not likely to be a major system. We're late in the season. Conditions expected to be less favorable. So more than likely, it's the type of thing we can handle. The next thing becomes, I know for many of you, does it cause a lot of rain or conditions not so great for the LSU-Bama game? We'll kind of address that through the week. All right, folks, we'll wrap it up. Thanks for watching this morning. As I said, we'll have more on air through the day and more on digital through the week.